The bitter wind cut through Sarah's threadbare dress like 1,000 needles, each gust stealing what little warmth remained in her body. Her feet, wrapped in rags that had once been leather boots, left bloody prints in the frost-hardened earth. The New Mexico territory stretched endlessly before her, a cruel expanse of sagebrush and stone beneath a sky threatening snow. She had been walking for 3 days. 3 days since the last town had driven her out with stones and curses. 3 days since she'd eaten anything more than melted snow and the bitter roots she'd learned to identify during her months of wandering. Her lips were cracked, bleeding. Her hands, once soft from years of turning Bible pages in her father's church, were now raw and swollen. Sarah pressed on, one foot before the other, because stopping meant dying. And despite everything, despite the shame that clung to her like a second skin, despite the hollow ache where her baby had once grown, some stubborn part of her still wanted to live. The memories came unbidden, as they always did when exhaustion weakened her defenses. She saw herself as she had been just 2 years ago, the minister's daughter in her Sunday dress, teaching children their letters in the church schoolroom, her father's pride, the town's example of Christian virtue. Then came that night, the mayor's son, Thomas Whitmore, with liquor on his breath and violence in his hands, the tearing of fabric, her screams swallowed by his palm over her mouth, the weight of him crushing her into the cold ground behind the church where she'd gone to fetch forgotten hymn books. She'd told her father the truth, showed him the bruises, the blood, but Thomas Whitmore had a different story, said she'd tempted him, lured him with wanton looks and unholy desires. And when her belly began to swell with unwanted life, the town chose to believe the mayor's son over the minister's daughter. Her father had given her 1 hour to gather her things. "You have shamed God's house," he'd said, his eyes as cold as this winter wind. "You are no daughter of mine." The baby had lived 3 days. 3 days of fevered cries in a charity hospital where the nurses whispered harlot when they thought she couldn't hear. She'd named him Samuel, after the prophet who had heard God's voice in the night. But God had been silent when her son's breathing stopped, silent as they'd wrapped his tiny body in rough cloth and taken him away. That was 8 months ago. 8 months of begging for work, of sleeping in barns and under bridges, of learning which men would give her bread for honest labor and which would demand payment of another kind. She'd become good at running, at reading the hunger in men's eyes before it could catch her, but now she could run no more. Her legs trembled with each step. The storm clouds above were pressing lower, and she could smell the snow coming. Without shelter, she would be dead by morning. Then she saw it, a thin line of smoke rising beyond a rocky ridge. Her heart leaped, then sank. Smoke meant people, and people meant either salvation or another rejection. But what choice did she have? The ranch sat in a natural hollow, protected from the worst of the wind by towering pines. It was modest but well kept. A log cabin with a stone chimney, a sturdy barn, a corral where 3 horses stood with their rumps to the wind. Someone had built this place with care, with intention to last. Sarah stood at the gate for a long moment, gathering courage. Her reflection in a water trough showed her what others would see, a vagrant woman, dirty and desperate, the kind decent folks warned their children about. But the cold was seeping into her bones, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She knocked on the door with numb fingers. Once, twice. The silence stretched so long she wondered if anyone was home, despite the smoke. Then came footsteps, heavy, measured. The door opened, and Sarah forgot how to breathe. The man who stood before her was massive, at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that filled the doorframe. His skin was the color of burnished copper, his hair black as midnight and hanging past his shoulders. High cheekbones and a strong jaw marked him as Apache, one of the feared warriors her father had called savage heathens from his pulpit. But it was his eyes that held her frozen, dark as the deep forest. They widened with something like shock as they took her in. His whole body went rigid, as if he'd seen a ghost. They stood that way for what felt like eternity, the Apache giant and the ruined preacher's daughter, locked in a moment of mutual disbelief. Sarah broke first, her survival instinct overcoming her paralysis. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Please, sir, I don't mean harm. I can work. I can clean your barn, tend your horses just for tonight, just until the storm passes." The man said nothing. His eyes traveled over her face with an intensity that should have frightened her but didn't. There was no lust in that gaze, no contempt, only a kind of stunned recognition that made no sense. "I won't cause trouble," Sarah continued, her words tumbling faster. "I know what I look like. I know what people say about women like me, but I'm a hard worker. I'll be gone come morning. You'll hardly know I was here." Still he stared, his massive frame blocking the warm air she could feel flowing from inside the cabin. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Please," she said one more time, and hated how broken she sounded. "I've nowhere else to go." Something shifted in his expression then, a crack in whatever spell had held him frozen. He stepped back, a single fluid movement, and gestured toward the barn with one large hand. "There," he said, and his voice was deep as thunder over distant mountains. The single word carried an accent she couldn't place, not quite the Apache dialect she'd heard in town, but something older, more isolated. "Thank you," Sarah breathed. "Thank you, sir. I promise." But he had already turned away, disappearing into the darkness of the cabin. The door remained open, though, and she understood. He would watch to make sure she went where she'd said. Trust was not part of this bargain. Sarah made her way to the barn on unsteady legs. Inside, she found what she'd hoped for, relatively fresh straw, walls that blocked the wind, the warm presence of animals. The 3 horses watched her with mild interest as she fashioned a bed in an empty stall. As she burrowed into the straw, pulling her thin shawl tight, she thought about the man's expression when he'd first seen her. That look of recognition, of being struck by lightning. Who had he seen when he looked at her? What ghost had she awakened in those dark eyes? Through a crack in the barn wall, she could see the cabin. A shadow passed by the window. The giant Apache. Still awake. Still watching. Sarah pulled straw over herself and closed her eyes, too exhausted to wonder why a savage warrior had shown her more mercy in 5 minutes than civilization had shown her in 8 months. The storm broke just after midnight, howling like all the demons her father had preached about. But Sarah slept through it, warm enough to dream for the first time in weeks. In her dreams, she had a home again. In her dreams, dark eyes watched over her with something almost like tenderness. Sarah woke before dawn, her body trained by months of vagrant life to rise before her hosts could find reason to regret their charity. The storm had passed, leaving the world wrapped in pristine white. Through the barn's gaps, she could see the first pale light touching the mountain peaks. Her muscles protested as she stood, stiff from cold and yesterday's endless walking. But she had made a promise, and promises were all she had left to offer. She found a pitchfork leaning against the wall and set to work mucking out the stalls, moving quietly to avoid startling the horses. The animals watched her with intelligent eyes as she worked. The largest, a bay stallion, snorted softly when she approached his stall. Sarah held out her hand, letting him catch her scent before she entered. "Easy, boy," she murmured, the way she'd learned from the stable hands back home. "I'm not here to hurt you." The horse settled, allowing her to work around him. Sarah lost herself in the rhythm of it, fork, lift, toss. Simple, honest labor that asked nothing of her but strength and persistence. By the time she finished the stalls, sweat had broken through her skin despite the cold, and the sun was fully up. She found a wood pile behind the barn and spent the next hour splitting logs. The axe was heavy, meant for hands larger than hers, but she managed. Each swing sent shocks through her arms, but it felt good to be useful, to earn her night's shelter properly. When she finally approached the cabin, arms full of firewood, the door stood slightly open. She knocked on the frame with her elbow. "Sir, I've brought wood for your fire." No answer came, but the door swung wider. Sarah took it as permission and entered. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean. Hand-hewn furniture, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with supplies. On the far wall hung weapons, a rifle, a bow, a knife with a curved blade. The room smelled of leather and pine smoke and something else, something wild she couldn't name. The Apache man sat at a rough table, his back to her. Before him lay the remains of a simple breakfast: cornmeal mush, dried meat. Another bowl sat across from him, steam still rising from its contents. Sarah set the wood by the fireplace and turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. Eat. She hesitated. In her experience, nothing from men came without cost. He turned then, those dark eyes finding hers. In daylight, she could see him better, the strong planes of his face, the scar that ran along his left jaw, the way his hair was streaked with premature silver, though he couldn't be past 40. He was handsome in a fierce way, like the mountains themselves. Eat, he said again, gesturing to the bowl. Then go. Sarah sat carefully, as if the chair might break beneath her weight of shame. The cornmeal was plain but hot, and she had to force herself not to wolf it down. He watched her eat with that same intense expression from yesterday, as if trying to solve a puzzle. When she finished, she rose to wash the bowl. But he waved her back. The wood, you split it. Yes, sir, and I mucked the stalls. The bay has a stone bruise on his left front hoof. Might want to check it. His eyebrows rose slightly. You know horses. My father kept a buggy team. The words slipped out before she could stop them. She never spoke of her past. But something about this man's steady presence made her careless. Your father? He said it like a statement, not a question. Sarah looked down at her hands. Thank you for the meal and the shelter. I'll be going now. She stood, but the room tilted suddenly. Black spots danced in her vision, and her knees buckled. She would have hit the floor, but massive hands caught her arms, steadying her with surprising gentleness. When did you last eat? His voice was closer now, rumbling through his chest. Before today. Sarah tried to think. 3 days, maybe 4. He made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite a sigh. The next thing she knew, she was being guided back to the chair. He moved to the shelves, returning with dried fruit and more meat. Eat slow, he commanded. Then rest. I can't. I've imposed enough. The storm will return tonight, worse than before. He moved to the window, studying the sky with the eye of someone who read weather like scripture. 3 days, maybe 4. Then you go. Sarah wanted to protest, but her body betrayed her with its weakness. I'll work for it, every day. I'll earn my keep. He turned back to her, and again that strange expression crossed his face. Recognition and pain mingled together. What is your name? Sarah. She almost gave her father's surname, but stopped. That name wasn't hers anymore. Just Sarah. Sarah. He said it slowly, as if tasting the word. Then, after a long pause, I am called Taza. Neither of them spoke after that. Sarah ate what he'd given her, each bite bringing strength back to her limbs. Taza returned to the window, standing with his back to her, tension in every line of his massive frame. When she finished, she stood carefully. I'll go back to the barn now, if there's anything else needs doing. The house. The words seemed pulled from him unwillingly. You clean. Yes, I've worked as a domestic, in the places that would hire her, before her reputation spread too far. He nodded once, then clean. Sarah spent the rest of the day scrubbing the cabin from top to bottom. It didn't need much. Taza kept his space orderly, but she found things to do. She washed the windows, beat the dust from the buffalo hide rug, organized the shelves. All the while, he came and went, tending his horses, checking trap lines. But she felt his eyes on her whenever he was near, that same studying gaze that made her feel like a book written in a language he'd once known but had half forgotten. As evening fell, she prepared a simple supper from the supplies she found: beans with salt pork, pan bread, coffee strong enough to float iron. She ate her portion quickly and retreated to wash the dishes. But Taza's voice stopped her. "Sit." She sat across from him, hands folded in her lap. "The bay. How did you know about his hoof?" "He was favoring it when I entered his stall, just slightly, but I could see." She paused. "My father's stable hand taught me to watch for such things." "Your father had servants?" Sarah's cheeks burned. "He was a minister. The church provided help. A holy man's daughter." Something flickered in Taza's eyes, amusement or irony. She couldn't tell. "And now?" The question hung between them like a blade. Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Now I'm no one's daughter." He studied her for another long moment, then stood abruptly. "The barn is too cold. There's a small room off the kitchen. Storage. I'll clear it." "The barn is fine. The barn is for animals." His tone brooked no argument. "You are not an animal." The kindness of it, being seen as human when so many had ceased to, brought tears to her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. Taza cleared the storage room with efficient movements, laying out blankets on a cot she hadn't noticed was there. It was tiny, but warm, with walls on all sides and a door she could close. "Thank you," she whispered. He paused in the doorway, his bulk filling the frame. For a moment, she thought he would speak. She could see words forming behind his eyes, but he only nodded and left her alone. That night, as the predicted storm began to howl outside, Sarah lay on her first real bed in months and wondered about the ghosts that haunted Taza's eyes. Who had she reminded him of? What loss had carved those lines of sorrow into his face? Through the thin wall, she could hear him moving about the main room, restless as a caged wolf. Once, she thought she heard him speak a name, soft, broken, in a language she didn't understand. A woman's name. She was certain, a name that sounded like grief itself. Sarah pulled the blanket over her head and prayed to a God she no longer trusted that she wouldn't bring this strange, kind man any more sorrow than he already carried. They were both walking wounded, she realized. Both refugees from different wars. Perhaps that was why he'd let her stay. Perhaps Broken recognized Broken, even across the divide of race and culture. Or perhaps she simply reminded him of someone he'd lost. Either way, she would earn her shelter. She would work until her hands bled if need be. And when the storm passed, she would leave as promised, taking nothing with her but the memory of the first kindness she'd known in months. Outside, the wind screamed like all the vengeful spirits of the frontier. But inside, for now, there was warmth and safety and the strange comfort of another wounded soul keeping watch through the night. The fever came on the third night, swift and merciless as a prairie fire. Sarah had worked through the day despite the ache in her bones, scrubbing the kitchen floor on hands and knees, pretending the dizziness was just fatigue. But as darkness fell, she could pretend no longer. She made it to her small room before her legs gave out, collapsing onto the cot as chills racked her body. The blanket felt paper-thin against the cold that seemed to come from inside her very marrow. Her teeth chattered so hard she feared they might crack. Through her delirium, she heard the main door open and close, Taza returning from checking his trap lines. She tried to rise, to prepare his evening meal as she had the previous nights, but her body refused to obey. The room spun like a child's top, and she fell back, a small cry escaping her lips. Footsteps approached her door. A knock, gentle but firm. "Sarah," she tried to answer but managed only a weak moan. The door opened, and Taza filled the frame, lantern light casting shadows across his face. He took one look at her, the sweat on her brow, the way she shivered violently despite the warmth of the room, and moved with sudden urgency. "No," she whispered as he approached. I'm unclean. The sickness." He ignored her protests, pressing a massive hand to her forehead. His touch was surprisingly gentle, calloused fingers cool against her burning skin. He spoke something in Apache, a curse or a prayer. She couldn't tell. Then, without hesitation, he gathered her into his arms. Sarah was not a small woman, but he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Her head fell against his chest, and through her fever, she could hear his heartbeat, steady, strong, alive. "Please," she mumbled against his shirt. "Don't. Not worth." "Quiet," he commanded, but his voice held no harshness. He carried her to the main room, laying her carefully on his own bed, a proper bed with a thick mattress and heavy quilts. The luxury of it made her want to weep. Taza worked with practiced efficiency. He stoked the fire until it roared, filling the room with blessed heat. From a wooden chest, he produced more blankets, layering them over her until only her face remained exposed. Then he disappeared outside, returning with snow that he wrapped in cloth and placed on her forehead. Through the night, he tended her. When the snow melted, he replaced it. When she thrashed in fever dreams, he held her shoulders steady with infinite patience. When she cried out for her dead child, shameful words torn from her without consent, he said nothing, only wiped the tears from her cheeks. Near dawn, the fever broke. Sarah woke to find herself drenched in sweat but lucid, the terrible fire in her bones reduced to mere ember. She was in a bed that smelled of pine and leather and man. Clean cloths had replaced her filthy dress. Someone had changed her clothes while she was insensible. Taza sat in a chair beside the bed, awake despite the hour. The lantern cast gold light across his features, softening the harsh planes of his face. He watched her with those dark eyes that seemed to hold whole histories. "You're awake." It wasn't a question. Sarah tried to sit up, but weakness kept her flat. You undressed me." There should have been shame in the words, but she was too tired for it. "You would have died in those wet rags." His tone was matter-of-fact. "I've seen women before. I was married." The word hung between them like a stone. "Water?" he asked. And when she nodded, he helped her drink from a tin cup. The liquid was flavored with something bitter, willow bark. She realized. Medicine. "Thank you," she whispered when the cup was empty. He set it aside, then leaned back in his chair. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other in the dim light. Finally, he spoke. "What is your full name?" The question surprised her. "Does it matter?" "Names have power. I would know yours." Sarah closed her eyes. "Sarah Grace Watson, former daughter of Reverend Josiah Watson of Cedar Springs, Texas. And the child you called for in your fever." The words were gentle, but they cut deep. "Samuel, he lived 3 days." Her voice broke. He was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, eyes like the sky before a storm." Taza was quiet for so long she thought he might have left. Then, "My wife's name was Ayana. It means eternal blossom in our language. She died 6 winters ago, along with our daughter. Soldiers came while I was hunting. When I returned..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Sarah opened her eyes, finding his face in the lamplight. The pain there was raw, even after 6 years. "How do you bear it?" "Some days I don't." He stood abruptly, moving to the fire. With his back to her, he continued. "When I first saw you at my door, I thought the spirits were playing cruel games. You have her face, not exactly, but enough. The same eyes, the same way of holding your mouth when you're determined." "I'm sorry," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. For not being his wife, for being alive when Ayana wasn't, for bringing his ghosts back to haunt him. He turned then, and something in his expression had shifted. "Don't apologize for breathing. Too many have stopped." He moved back to the chair, sitting heavily. "Tell me how a minister's daughter comes to wander the territory alone." So she told him. All of it. Thomas Whitmore's attack, her father's betrayal, the baby born too early in a cold charity ward, the months of running, begging, surviving. She spoke until her throat was raw, purging the poison of memory into the space between them. When she finished, Taza's hands were clenched into fists. "This man who forced himself on you, he lives. He's deputy sheriff now." The bitter irony of it twisted her mouth. His father bought him a badge to go with his innocence. "Among my people, such a man would not see another sunrise." Among your people, would I be blamed for his crime? Taza met her eyes steadily. No. A woman's body is her own. To take it by force is to declare war on her entire clan. The shame belongs to the attacker alone. The simple certainty of his words broke something inside her. Sarah began to cry. Not the careful, silent tears she'd learned to shed, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook her whole body. Months of pain and shame poured out of her like pus from a lanced wound. Taza didn't comfort her with empty words or unwanted touch. He simply sat there, solid as a mountain, letting her grief rage like a storm. When the sobs finally quieted, he handed her a cloth for her face. "You're not what they named you," he said quietly. "Not ruined, not shameful. You survived. That takes a strength most don't possess." Sarah wiped her eyes, exhausted but strangely lighter. "Is that why you let me stay? Because I remind you of her?" He considered the question, then shook his head slowly. "At first, perhaps, but now." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Now I think the spirit sent you here for different reasons. We're both among the walking dead. Sarah Grace Watson. Maybe it's time we remembered how to live?" The name sounded strange on his lips. Her full name, spoken like a recognition of who she truly was beneath the shame and sorrow. Not just Sarah the vagrant, but Sarah Grace, who had once taught children and sung hymns and believed the world was fundamentally good. "I don't know if I remember how," she admitted. "Neither do I." He stood, moving to add wood to the fire. "But perhaps we can learn together. You need food and rest. I need..." He trailed off, then finished quietly. "I need to stop seeing ghosts in every shadow." As dawn broke fully, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold, they sat in companionable silence, two broken souls in a hard land, bound by loss and the tentative hope that broken things might sometimes be mended. Sarah drifted back to sleep as Taza kept watch, no longer a stranger in a strange house, but something harder to name. Not quite friend, not quite anything else. Just two people who had forgotten how to trust the world, learning to trust each other one careful moment at a time. When she woke again, sunlight was streaming through the windows, and the smell of cooking meat filled the air. Taza stood at the stove, his movements domestic and practiced. He'd survived his loss by maintaining routine. She realized, by keeping his hands busy and his days ordered. "Can you sit up?" he asked without turning. Sarah tried and managed it, though the effort left her breathless. He brought her a plate, venison, pan bread, dried berries reconstituted in water, simple food, but prepared with care. "Tomorrow, if you're strong enough, I'll teach you to make fry bread," he said, returning to his own meal. Ayana's recipe. It should not die with her. The offer was more than cooking lessons. It was an invitation into his world, his memories, his culture. Sarah understood the magnitude of it, the trust it required from a man who had lost everything to white soldiers. "I would be honored to learn," she said softly. And so began their careful dance of healing. Two wounded souls learning to exist in the same space without fear. Outside, winter raged on, but inside the cabin, something fragile and green began to grow. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. A tender shoot pushing through frozen ground, reaching toward a sun neither quite believed in but both desperately needed. The world had broken them in different ways, but perhaps, just perhaps, they didn't have to stay broken forever. The days that followed blended into a rhythm of shared work and careful silence. Sarah grew stronger, her body remembering what it meant to be nourished and safe. She learned to make fry bread from Taza, her clumsy fingers gradually mastering the technique under his patient guidance. They worked side by side, she cooking and cleaning, he tending the horses and checking his trap lines. It was a fragile peace, built on routine and the unspoken agreement to avoid touching the wounds they'd revealed to each other. But peace, Sarah had learned, was always fragile in the territory. The accident happened on a clear morning 2 weeks after her fever. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of muddy ground and swollen streams. Sarah had volunteered to fetch water from the creek, wanting to spare Taza the chore after he'd spent the night tending a colicky horse. The path to the creek was treacherous with ice and snowmelt. She picked her way carefully, the heavy bucket swinging from her hand. But as she knelt at the water's edge, the bank gave way, the world tilted, and suddenly she was in the water, the freezing current pulling at her skirts. The creek wasn't deep, but the cold was paralyzing. Her dress, heavy with water, dragged her down. She fought to find footing on the slippery stones, but the current was stronger than it looked. Panic clawed at her throat as water closed over her head. Then strong hands seized her arms, hauling her up and out with fierce strength. Taza had her on the bank before she could fully register his presence. He must have heard her fall, must have run from the cabin. "Sarah!" His voice was sharp with fear. "Look at me!" She tried to focus, but the cold had stolen her breath. Her thoughts. She was shaking so violently she couldn't speak. Taza didn't hesitate. He lifted her again, running toward the cabin with long strides that ate up the ground. Inside, he set her on her feet before the fire, but her numb fingers couldn't manage the buttons of her dress. She stood there helplessly, teeth chattering, until he brushed her hands aside. "Forgive me," he muttered, and began working the buttons himself. His fingers were swift but impersonal, focused on the task of saving her from the cold. But as the sodden fabric fell away, something shifted. His hand slowed, trembled slightly. Sarah, even through her shivering, felt the change in the air between them. She stood before him in only her thin shift, the wet fabric clinging to every curve. Taza's eyes traveled her face, her throat, then jerked away as if burned. He grabbed a blanket from the bed, wrapping it around her with movements that were almost rough. "Get warm," he said, his voice hoarse. He turned to leave, but Sarah caught his arm. "Taza!" He stopped but didn't turn. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Thank you," she whispered. "Again." He did turn then, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. Hunger was there, raw and undisguised, but beneath it was something else, a tenderness that made the hunger sacred rather than frightening. "You make it hard to honor my promise," he said quietly. "What promise?" "To myself, to Ayana's memory, that I would not—" He stopped, jaw working. "You should get dressed." He left her then, fleeing to the barn like a man escaping temptation. Sarah dressed in dry clothes with shaking hands, but the trembling wasn't entirely from cold anymore. The way he'd looked at her, the careful restraint in his touch, it awakened something in her she'd thought Thomas Whitmore had killed forever. That evening, their usual comfortable silence was charged with unspoken words. They ate without meeting each other's eyes, the memory of the morning hanging between them like a physical presence. Finally, Sarah couldn't bear it. "I'm not her," she said softly. "Ayana, I'm not her, and I can never be." Taza's head came up sharply. "I know that. Do you?" She set down her spoon, gathering courage. "Because sometimes you look at me, and I can see her ghost in your eyes." He was quiet for a long moment, then rose and moved to the window. "You're right. At first, all I could see was her shadow in you. But now?" He turned to face her, and the honesty in his expression took her breath. "Now I see Sarah. Brave Sarah who survived what would break most. Strong Sarah who works until her hands bleed without complaint. Kind Sarah who speaks to my horses like they're children." A pause, then quieter. "Beautiful Sarah, who makes me remember I'm still a man, not just a ghost myself." The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and precious. Sarah stood on unsteady legs, moving toward him slowly, as if approaching a wild animal. "I'm not whole," she said when she was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "What Thomas did to me, what I lost, it changed me, broke parts of me that might never mend. We're all broken here." Taza replied, "The whole territory is full of the wounded and lost, but broken doesn't mean worthless." Sarah reached up, her fingers barely brushing his jaw. He went very still, but didn't pull away. "What are we doing?" she whispered. "I don't know." His hand covered hers, pressing it against his face. "But I'm tired of being alone with my ghosts." That night, she came to his door. She didn't knock, just stood there in her nightdress, barefoot and trembling. When he opened the door, there were no words. Words would have broken the spell. He simply stepped back, letting her enter. They came together like two rivers meeting, slow at first, tentative, then with growing certainty. His hands were gentle but sure, erasing the memory of cruel touch with reverence. When he kissed her, it was like coming home to a place she'd never been but always belonged. Later, as they lay entwined in his bed, Sarah traced the scars on his chest, battle wounds, each with its own story of survival. He caught her hand, pressing it flat against his heart. "This changes things," he said quietly. "Yes. The world won't be kind to us. My people will say I'm dishonoring Ayanna's memory. Your people will call you worse names than they already do." Sarah turned in his arms, meeting his eyes in the dim light. "When has the world ever been kind to either of us?" He had no answer for that. They held each other as dawn approached. Two people who had found an unexpected harbor in the storm of their lives. It wasn't the love either had known before, not the innocent passion of youth or the steady warmth of chosen partnership. This was something forged in loss and loneliness, tempered by pain into something stronger than either had thought possible. "Stay," Taza whispered against her hair. Not just for the night, Sarah understood. Stay for whatever time they could steal from a world that would condemn them. Stay until the ghosts finally faded. Stay until they remembered how to live instead of just survive. "Yes," she whispered back, and felt something inside her chest, some last wall she'd built around her heart, finally crumble. They slept as the sun rose, wrapped in each other and in the fragile hope that two broken souls might make something whole. Outside, the last of the winter snow continued to melt, feeding the streams that would soon bring spring to the desert. And in the cabin where sorrow had lived so long, something new began to bloom. Not perfect, not without thorns, but alive and reaching toward the light. Spring came slowly to the high country, painting the world in tentative shades of green. With it came a transformation in the cabin that had once housed only sorrow. Sarah's laughter could be heard ringing across the meadow as Taza taught her to shoot his bow. Her aim was terrible at first, arrows flying wild into the brush, but she improved daily under his patient instruction. "Pull with your back, not your arm," he corrected, standing behind her to adjust her stance. His hands on her shoulders sent warmth through her body that had nothing to do with the exercise. "Like this? Better. Now breathe out as you release." The arrow flew true, striking the target if not the center. Sarah whooped with delight, turning to throw her arms around his neck. He caught her easily, spinning her around as she laughed. It was moments like these, spontaneous, joyful, free, that made her realize how far they'd both come from those first frozen days. The work of the ranch continued, but now it was shared work, companionable and purposeful. Taza taught her to ride properly, not the sedate side saddle of her former life, but the practical horsemanship of the frontier. She learned to read weather signs, to identify edible plants, to move quietly through the forest like his people did. In return, she brought music back into his life. She sang while she worked, hymns at first, then folk songs, then Apache melodies he taught her, stumbling over the unfamiliar words but catching the rhythm. Sometimes she caught him watching her with an expression of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe the sound of happiness in his home again. Their days took on a gentle pattern, morning chores together, afternoons spent on whatever tasks the ranch required, evenings by the fire where she would mend clothes while he worked leather or carved wood, and nights. Nights were theirs alone, a sacred space where past wounds faded in the face of present joy. It was on such a peaceful afternoon, as Sarah was hanging wash and Taza was repairing a fence, that the riders appeared on the ridge. There were 5 of them, moving with the purposeful pace of men on a mission. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, Jack Morrison, owner of the general store in Cedar Junction, the nearest town. She'd tried to buy supplies there once, months ago, before learning that her reputation had spread even to these remote settlements. "Taza," she called quietly, but he had already seen them. He set down his tools and moved to stand beside her, a subtle positioning that placed him between her and the approaching men. The riders stopped just outside the yard, spreading into a loose semicircle. Morrison, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained whiskers, leaned forward in his saddle. "Afternoon, Taza," he said, though his eyes were fixed on Sarah. "Heard you had a visitor. My business is my own." Taza replied evenly. Sure. Morrison spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Except when your business might affect the rest of us. You know who this woman is? I know who she is to me." Sarah felt Taza's hand brush hers, a silent message of support. She lifted her chin, meeting Morrison's contemptuous gaze steadily. "She's the Watson whore," one of the other riders said bluntly. "The one who seduced the mayor's boy back in Cedar Springs, then killed her bastard baby." The words hit like physical blows, but before Sarah could respond, Taza stepped forward. The movement was subtle but menacing, and the riders' horses shifted nervously. "Watch your tongue," he said quietly, "or lose it. Now. Morrison raised a placating hand, though his expression remained hard. "No need for threats. We're just concerned citizens. This woman's got a reputation for bringing trouble wherever she goes. Disease, they say. Moral contamination. We got wives and daughters to think about." "Then think about them in your own homes." Taza said, "This is my land. Apache land." Another rider muttered, "Stolen from decent folks. Land I bought legal with trapped fur." Taza corrected, "The deed is in the courthouse, same as yours." Morrison's face darkened. "Don't get smart. Indian, we're trying to be neighborly here. That woman's no good, cast out by her own father, a man of God. You'd be better off sending her on her way before she brings her curse on you, too." Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. "Mr. Morrison," she said, stepping out from behind Taza despite his attempt to stop her. "I've done nothing but try to live quietly and work honestly. If that threatens you somehow, shut your mouth, Jezebel." Morrison snarled. "Bad enough you corrupt decent Christian souls. Now you're living in sin with a heathen savage. You're an abomination before God and man." The words were ugly, but not unexpected. Sarah had heard variations of them for months, but she felt Taza go rigid beside her, saw his hand move toward the knife at his belt. "No," she said softly, catching his arm. "They're not worth it." Morrison laughed, an ugly sound. "Listen to your whore. Indian. She knows what happens to savages who raise hands against white men." "What happens?" Taza said with deadly calm. "Is what happened to the last group who threatened someone under my protection. Ask the Comancheros who used to raid through here. Oh, wait, you can't. The coyotes scattered their bones years ago." The threat was delivered quietly, but it had the desired effect. The riders exchanged uneasy glances. Taza's reputation as a warrior might be in the past, but legends died hard in the territory. "You'd choose her over your neighbors?" Morrison asked. "Over peace. I choose justice over mob rule, decency over hypocrisy. You say she's diseased? I see no sickness but the poison in your hearts. You call her fallen. I see a woman still standing despite your attempts to break her. You name her whore. I name her survivor." Sarah's eyes burned with unshed tears. No one had ever defended her like this. Not her father, not the law, not even herself. To hear her worth proclaimed in Taza's steady voice was like salve on old wounds. Morrison gathered his reins, face twisted with disgust. "Mark my words. Apache, no good will come of harboring that woman. She's cursed, and she'll bring that curse on you. Don't come crying to town when trouble finds you." "I never have," Taza replied. The riders wheeled their horses, but Morrison turned back for a parting shot. "And you," he pointed at Sarah. You'd best remember what happens to whores who forget their place. The territory has ways of dealing with your kind." They rode off in a cloud of dust and threats, leaving Sarah and Taza standing in the yard. When they were gone, she found herself shaking, not with fear, but with rage. "I should leave," she said quietly. "They're right about one thing. I do bring trouble." Taza turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "The trouble was here long before you. It has 1,000 faces. Hate, fear, the need to make others small so they can feel big. You didn't bring it. You just gave it a target. But now you're a target too." He shrugged. "I've been a target since the day I was born, Apache, in a world that wants us dead or tamed. At least now I have something worth fighting for again." That night, they made love with a fierce tenderness, each touch an affirmation against the world's condemnation. Later, as they lay entwined, Sarah voiced the fear that had been growing since the riders left. "They'll come back, maybe not Morrison, but others, men who think a woman alone is fair game, who see your protection as a challenge. Then we'll face them together." He stroked her hair, his touch soothing. "I've lived too long with nothing to lose. It made me careless with my life. Now," he tilted her chin up to meet his eyes, "now I have reason to be careful, to be strong, to fight if needed. I don't want you to fight for me. I want—" She struggled to find the words. "I want to fight beside you." A slow smile crossed his face, a rare sight that transformed his harsh features. "Then tomorrow, we practice with the rifle. The bow is good, but a Winchester speaks louder to men like Morrison." Sarah curled closer to him, drawing strength from his solid presence. The world outside might condemn them, might threaten and rage, but here in their bed, in their home, they had carved out a space where different rules applied, where a broken woman could be whole, where an Apache warrior could love without shame, where two outcasts could build something worth defending. The spring wind rattled the windows, carrying the scent of new growth and distant rain. Change was coming. Sarah could feel it in her bones. But for tonight, she was safe in the arms of a man who saw her truly, who named her survivor instead of victim, who offered his strength without stealing hers. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Morrison would spread his poison in town. Other men would come, drawn by rumors of a fallen woman easy for the taking. The world would do its best to tear them apart. But tonight, they were together, and that, Sarah was learning, was its own form of resistance. Love in defiance of hate, joy in the face of those who would deny it. Life full and sweet, despite everything that had tried to kill it. She fell asleep to the steady beat of Taza's heart. Her hand splayed over the scar where an old wound had healed. Tomorrow they would learn to fight together. But tonight, loving each other was victory enough. The decision to leave came on a morning when Sarah found boot prints circling the cabin, fresh ones, made in the night while they slept. Someone had been watching, testing their defenses. Taza studied the tracks with grim understanding. "They're getting bolder," he said. "Next time they might not just look." Sarah packed her few belongings with hands that shook only slightly. The small room off the kitchen had become her first real home in over a year. But she'd learned not to grow too attached to places. Survival meant being ready to move. "You don't have to go," Taza said from the doorway. "We can stand against them." "And how many will you have to kill?" She folded her spare dress carefully, not meeting his eyes. "How long before they bring the law? Claim you kidnapped me. Use any excuse to take your land. I won't be the reason you lose everything." He crossed the room in 2 strides, catching her hands. "You are not responsible for their hatred. No, but I'm the excuse they'll use to act on it." She pulled free gently. "I've brought you nothing but trouble. Taza, you saved me, gave me shelter, gave me—" Her voice caught. "Gave me more than I ever hope to have again. Let me give you something in return. Peace. Peace." He said the word like it tasted bitter. "I had peace for 6 years. Peace is another word for slowly dying." But Sarah had made her choice. That afternoon, While Taza was checking his trap lines, she slipped away. She took only what she'd come with, leaving behind the clothes he'd bought her, the moccasins he'd made, everything that marked her time in his home. Only at the last moment did she weaken, taking one small carved horse he'd been working on, something to remember when the nights grew too long. She found the abandoned prospector's cabin 5 miles north, half collapsed but with walls still standing. It would do. It had to. She set about making it livable with the skills Taza had taught her, chinking gaps with mud, laying pine boughs for bedding, setting snares for rabbits. The first night alone, she heard wolves howling in the distance and remembered Taza telling her they rarely attacked humans. The second night, she heard nothing but wind, and that was worse. By the third night, when she found fresh venison wrapped in cloth outside her door, she knew he'd found her. He didn't approach, didn't try to convince her to return, but the gifts continued: meat, firewood already split, herbs for tea. Sometimes she caught glimpses of him in the trees, watching to make sure she was safe. He was honoring her choice while refusing to abandon her entirely. Sarah threw herself into survival. She gathered edible plants, improved her shelter, even managed to trade pelts from her snares for flour and salt with a traveling merchant who didn't know her reputation. She cut her hair short with her knife, partly for practicality and partly as a kind of mourning for the life she'd briefly tasted and lost. Days blended into weeks. Her body grew lean and hard from constant work. Her hands, once soft enough to turn Bible pages, became as rough as any frontier woman's. She learned to be truly alone, to find strength in silence, to stop jumping at every night sound. But she also learned that survival and living were different things. She survived each day, but she wasn't alive the way she'd been in Taza's cabin. Learning to laugh again, learning to trust touch, learning that she was more than her worst moment. Then came the storm. It struck with the sudden violence of spring weather in the high country. Sarah had seen the black clouds building but misjudged how quickly they would arrive. The temperature plummeted. Rain turned to sleet, then to snow driven sideways by howling wind. Her makeshift cabin, adequate for mild weather, was no match for this assault. Snow forced its way through every gap. The roof, already weakened, began to groan ominously. Sarah huddled near her small fire, feeding it with her last dry wood, knowing it wouldn't last the night. By midnight, she was burning furniture scraps left by the prospector. By dawn, she was burning nothing, the fire dead. Her body shaking so violently she couldn't hold the flint steady to strike new sparks. Ice had formed on the inside walls. Her breath came in painful gasps that sent spikes through her chest. She tried to stand, to move, to generate warmth, but her legs buckled. The world grayed at the edges. Some distant part of her mind noted the irony. She'd survived assault, abandonment, starvation, only to die a few miles from the man she loved because she was too proud or too protective to accept his help. The door exploded inward. Through her fading vision, she saw Taza filling the entrance, snow swirling around him like a fury. His face was terrible, not with anger, but with fear. "Foolish woman," he growled, scooping her into his arms. "Stubborn, foolish woman." She tried to protest, but her voice was gone. He wrapped her in his own coat and ran through the storm, his long strides eating distance despite the deep snow. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of his warmth, his strength, the steady rhythm of his movement, then blessed heat, the familiar smell of his cabin, soft furs beneath her, hands, gentle despite their urgency, stripping away her frozen clothes, wrapping her in warm blankets, a cup at her lips with liquid that burned her throat but spread warmth through her chest. "Why?" Taza's voice, rough with emotion. "Why would you choose death over letting me protect you?" Sarah's voice came out as a croak. "Not death, freedom, yours." He pulled back to look at her, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Freedom to what? To check empty traps, to talk to horses, to wake each day knowing you're out here, suffering for some misguided belief that you're poison." He cupped her face with one large hand. My freedom died the day you walked away. All I had left was duty. To watch, to protect from a distance, to honor your choice even as it killed us both slowly. The town. Damn the town. The profanity, so unlike him, showed his agitation. Damn Morrison and his riders. Damn anyone who thinks they can dictate who I shelter, who I protect, who I love. The word hung between them like a revelation. In all their time together, through all their intimacies, neither had spoken it aloud. Now it filled the space, undeniable and transforming. "You love me?" Sarah whispered. "From the moment you stood at my door, half dead but still fighting. From the moment you looked at my scars and saw survival instead of savagery. From every moment since, watching you become who you were meant to be before the world tried to break you." He smoothed her hair back from her face. "I love you, Sarah Grace Watson. Not because you remind me of the past, but because you make me believe in a future." Tears ran down her cheeks, salt warmth in contrast to the ice that had nearly claimed her. "I left to save you. Then you failed." His thumb wiped away her tears. "Because without you, there's nothing left to save." When she could speak again, she told him the truth. "I love you too. So much it terrifies me. I've lost everyone I've ever loved. I couldn't bear—" He silenced her with a kiss, gentle but sure. "Then we face the fear together. We face Morrison, the town, the whole territory if needed, together. No more running, no more noble sacrifices, together or not at all." Sarah nodded against his chest, feeling the last of her walls crumble. She'd tried to protect him by leaving, but had only managed to hurt them both. Love, she was learning, wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about choosing to stand together against whatever came. Although, Taza added with a hint of his rare humor, "Next time you decide to be noble, perhaps choose summer. Easier to find you when you're not buried in snow." She laughed, a creaky sound but real, and felt something resettle in her chest. Not her old life coming back, but a new one taking root. A life where she was neither the minister's daughter nor the ruined woman, but simply Sarah, loved by Taza, learning to build something worth defending. Outside, the storm began to ease. Inside, two people held each other and made plans. They would go to the territorial capital, find a judge who would marry them legally. Let Morrison and his kind challenge a legal marriage. They would build higher fences, keep weapons ready, make it clear that this ranch would defend itself. But those were tomorrow's battles. Tonight, Sarah was home. Not in a place, but in the arms of a man who'd tracked her through a blizzard because her absence was worse than any danger her presence might bring. Tomorrow they would face the world together. Tonight, being together was enough. The days following her return were different. Where before they had moved around each other with careful courtesy, now there was an ease born of truth spoken and choices made. Sarah wore the clothes Taza had bought her without guilt. She sang while she worked without wondering if the sound bothered him. They touched casually, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing as they passed tools, small affirmations that they were both still there. Still choosing this, it was on such an ordinary morning, 2 weeks after the storm, that Sarah felt the first wave of nausea. She was collecting eggs when the smell of the chicken coop, usually unremarkable, sent her rushing outside to empty her stomach behind the barn. Taza found her there, pale and shaking. "The meat from last night? I'll check the rest." "No." Sarah wiped her mouth, her mind racing through dates and signs she'd been too distracted to notice. "It's not the meat." Understanding dawned in his eyes. Without a word, he helped her to the cabin, settled her in a chair with cool water. Then he sat across from her, waiting. "I think," Sarah's hand went to her stomach instinctively, "I think I'm with child." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of what this meant. Sarah watched emotions chase across Taza's face, surprise, concern, something that might have been wonder. "You're afraid," he observed quietly. "Terrified." The admission came out raw. "Last time, I lost him. 3 days. Taza, he lived 3 days and then just stopped. What if I can't carry a baby properly? What if my body is broken that way too? He moved to kneel before her chair, taking her hands in his. What if it's not? And even if everything goes well, what kind of life would a child have? Half Apache, half white, born to unmarried parents who are both outcasts. The world will be cruel. The world is cruel to everyone, in different ways. Taza said, but it can also be beautiful. A child of two worlds might see things others miss, might build bridges others cannot. Sarah searched his face. You want this child? I want what you want, but... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. After Ayana and our daughter died, I thought that part of my life was over, the part where I taught small hands to hold a bow, where I told stories by the fire, where I had a reason to make the world better instead of just surviving it. His thumb stroked over her knuckles. If you want this child, I will love it with everything I have. If you don't or can't, I will love you just the same. Sarah burst into tears, not the careful weeping she'd learned to hide, but messy, grateful sobs. Taza gathered her against his chest, holding her while she cried out her fear and hope in equal measure. When she calmed, they talked practically. She would need to see a doctor or midwife, not in Cedar Junction where hostility awaited, but perhaps in Santa Fe. They would need supplies, preparations, and they would need to be even more careful about security. We should marry, Taza said. Legally. It won't stop all the talk, but it gives the child legitimacy in white law, and in Apache law. A shadow crossed his face. My people, many will see it as betrayal, marrying the enemy, but some will understand. Love is love, and children are sacred regardless of their blood. They made plans to travel to Santa Fe within the week. But first, Sarah insisted on visiting the small cemetery behind the cabin, where Taza had buried his wife and daughter 6 years ago. She knelt between the two graves, marked with painted stones in the Apache way. Ayana, she said softly, feeling only a little foolish talking to the dead. I'm not trying to replace you. I could never do that. But I love him, and I promise to take care of him as best I can. And this child, if the spirits are willing, this child will know about you, about their sister who came before. Your memory won't die in this house. Wind stirred the pines overhead, and Sarah chose to take it as acceptance. That night, as they lay together, Taza placed his hand over her still flat stomach. Boy or girl? He asked. I don't know. Last time, I was so sick, so frightened. I never let myself wonder. She covered his hand with hers. What do you hope for? Healthy, strong, that's all. He was quiet for a moment. Although a daughter who looks like you would be a gift, a son with your courage would be a blessing. They were building dreams on fragile hopes. Sarah knew. So much could go wrong. Her body could fail again. The town's hostility could escalate. The child could face challenges neither parent could fully understand. But for tonight, she allowed herself to hope, to imagine teaching a small child to make fry bread the way Taza had taught her, to picture little feet running through the meadow, chasing butterflies, to dream of lullabies sung in 2 languages, of stories told from 2 traditions, of a love strong enough to protect against the world's cruelty. Taza began to hum, an Apache lullaby he'd mentioned once but never sung. The melody was haunting and beautiful, carrying promises of safety and strength. Sarah closed her eyes and let it wash over her, let it seep into her bones where the new life was taking root. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. The trip to Santa Fe, the search for a doctor who would treat her with respect despite her circumstances, the legal marriage that would bind them in white law as they were already bound in their hearts, the preparations for a child who would navigate between worlds. But tonight, they were a family. Not the kind recognized by churches or society, but real nonetheless. A warrior and a survivor. A man who had lost everything and a woman who had been thrown away, building something new from the ashes of their former lives. Sarah drifted to sleep with Taza's hand still protective over her womb, his lullaby still soft in the darkness, somewhere in the spirit world. She hoped Ayanna was watching with approval. Somewhere in heaven. She hoped her lost Samuel was waiting to be a big brother. And here in this cabin, where sorrow had given way to joy, where two broken people had learned to heal together, a new story was beginning. It would not be easy. It would not be without pain. But it would be theirs. And they would face it together. The spring wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of new growth and endless possibility. And in the heart of the high country, love continued to work its quiet miracle of transformation. One careful day at a time. The marriage certificate from Santa Fe should have made things better. It was legal proof, stamped and sealed, that Sarah was now Mrs. Taza Crow, the Anglo name he'd adopted for dealing with white authorities. But paper meant little to men determined to see only what they wanted to see. The trouble started small. Cut fence lines that let Taza's horses wander. Dead animals left at their gate. Words painted on rocks along their property line that made Sarah's cheeks burn with anger and shame. Taza repaired the damage without comment, but she saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand never strayed far from his rifle when working outside. Sarah's pregnancy progressed, her body remembering what to do even as her mind wrestled with fear. The sickness passed after the first months, replaced by a vitality she hadn't felt since before her first loss. Her belly rounded gently, and the baby moved within her, strong movements that made her laugh and cry simultaneously. It was during her 5th month, on a clear autumn day when the aspens had turned to gold, that Thomas Whitmore returned to her life. She was in the garden, harvesting squash for winter storage, when the shadow fell across her. Some instinct made her grip the knife she'd been using, made her turn slowly as if facing a predator. He sat on a black horse just beyond the garden fence, older now, wearing a deputy's badge that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The years had thickened him, coarsened features that had once held boyish charm, but the eyes were the same, cold, entitled, amused by others' pain. Well, Thomas drawled. Sarah Watson, or should I say, Sarah Crow. He laughed at his own wordplay. When I heard rumors that the holy minister's daughter had taken up with an Apache, I had to see for myself. Sarah straightened, one hand protective over her belly, the other still holding the knife. State your business or leave. This is private property. Haven't we gotten bold? He leaned forward in his saddle, eyes traveling over her changed body with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. Last time I saw you, you were much more accommodating. Last time you saw me, you were committing a crime. His face darkened. Crime. I remember it differently. I remember a preacher's daughter who lured me behind the church, then cried rape when her father found out. Lucky for you, he just threw you out instead of having you arrested for bearing false witness. Sarah felt the old rage rise, but now it had purpose, direction. We both know the truth, Thomas, and someday you'll answer for it. To who? Your savage husband? He laughed again. I'm the law now. Sarah, deputy sheriff of 3 counties. I could arrest him right now for kidnapping a white woman. Who'd believe otherwise? Everyone knows you weren't in your right mind after you killed your bastard. I didn't kill my child. The words came out low. Dangerous. He died of fever because the hospital you and your father's money sent me to cared more about punishing unwed mothers than saving babies. Details. Thomas waved dismissively. Then his eyes sharpened. But what's this? Another bastard on the way? You do spread your legs easily these days. The knife left Sarah's hand before she consciously chose to throw it. It sank into the fence post inches from Thomas's leg, vibrating with the force of impact. His horse shied, nearly unseating him. The next one won't miss, she said calmly. Thomas's face flushed purple as he fought to control his mount. You dare threaten an officer of the law? I see no officer. I see a criminal trespassing on my land. Your land? He finally steadied the horse, his hand moving to his gun. Nothing here is yours, whore. Not the land, not the cabin, not even the half-breed growing in your belly. It all belongs to that Apache. And when I'm done, he'll hang for kidnapping and corrupting a white woman. Try it. The voice came from behind Thomas, cold as winter wind. Taza stood at the corner of the cabin, Winchester aimed steady at the deputy's back. He'd approached silent as smoke, and Thomas went rigid in his saddle. "You must be the Apache," Thomas said, not turning. "I'm Deputy Sheriff Whitmore, and I'm here investigating reports of a kidnapped woman." "You're here because you're a coward who preys on women," Taza corrected. "Sarah told me about you, about what you did. Among my people, such men are castrated and left for the ants." Thomas's hand twitched toward his gun. The sound of Taza's rifle cocking stopped him. "Here's what will happen," Taza continued in that same deadly calm voice. "You will leave. You will not return. You will not speak Sarah's name again. If you do, if you come near her or send others to do your work, I will find you. And deputy or not, what's left won't be enough to identify. You're threatening a lawman. I'm making a promise to a rapist." Taza moved into Thomas's view, the rifle never wavering. "Your badge means nothing here. Your father's money means nothing. You are nothing but a weak man who takes by force what he could never earn. Leave now, while you still can." For a moment, the tableau held Sarah by her garden, one hand on her belly, Taza with his rifle raised. Thomas caught between them, his face cycling through rage, fear, and calculation. Finally, Thomas wheeled his horse around. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll be back with a posse. We'll see how brave you are when you're outnumbered 10-1. "Then bring 20, Taza replied. "Bring 30. It won't matter." Thomas spurred his horse viciously and galloped away, dust rising in his wake. Only when he was out of sight did Taza lower the rifle, crossing to Sarah in quick strides. "Are you hurt? The baby?" "We're fine," but her hands were shaking as she retrieved her knife from the fence post. "He'll do what he says. He'll come back with men, make up some story. Let him come." Taza's eyes were hard as flint. "I've fought Comancheros, Mexican soldiers, U.S. cavalry. A soft deputy with a grudge doesn't frighten me." But Sarah knew it was more complex than that. Thomas had the law on his side, or at least its appearance. He could make their lives hell within the system, turn their marriage into a crime, their child into evidence of wrongdoing. That night, as they lay together, she voiced her fears. "Maybe we should leave, head further west or north to Colorado, somewhere they don't know our history." Taza was quiet for a long moment. "I thought of that, after Ayanna died. I could have gone anywhere, but this land, her spirit is here. Our daughter's spirit is here. Now your spirit and mine are woven into this place too. And soon, our child's will be. I won't be driven from sacred ground by cowards." Sarah understood. This wasn't just property, it was home in the deepest sense. The place where they'd found each other, healed each other, built their love against all odds. To leave would be to let Thomas and men like him win. "Then we prepare," she said. "We make this place a fortress if we have to." The old warrior's wife speaks, Taza said with a slight smile. "Tomorrow I'll ride to the Apache camp 2 valleys over. My mother's cousin lives there. He might not approve of our marriage, but he hates white lawmen more. He'll send word if posses are forming. And I'll go to town, not Cedar Junction, Millbrook, where they don't know me as well. Stock up on ammunition, supplies, maybe feel out if there are any sympathetic ears." They spent the rest of the night planning, turning their home into something that could withstand siege if necessary. It wasn't the life either had imagined, constantly looking over their shoulders, preparing for violence. But it was their life, their choice, their stand. As dawn broke, Sarah felt the baby move within her, a strong kick that seemed like agreement. This child would be born into struggle, but also into fierce love and iron determination. It would know parents who refused to bow to injustice, who carved out space for happiness despite the world's cruelty. "Whatever comes," she told Taza as he saddled his horse, "we face it together." He kissed her deeply, one hand splayed protective over her belly. "Together," he agreed. Always. As he rode toward the Apache camp and she prepared for her own journey. Sarah thought about Thomas Whitmore's threat, He would come back. She knew it in her bones. But he would find them ready. He would find that the woman he'd brutalized had become someone he never expected. A survivor who'd found her strength, her voice, and her perfect partner in defiance. The aspens shivered in the morning breeze, gold leaves falling like coins. Change was in the air. Sarah could feel it. But for the first time since that terrible night behind the church, she wasn't afraid. She had too much to protect now, too much to fight for. Let them come. She and Taza would be ready. The courtroom in Santa Fe was packed to capacity, the air thick with tobacco smoke and hostility. Sarah sat as straight as her 8-month pregnancy would allow, hands folded over her swollen belly. Beside her, Taza remained motionless, his face carved from stone as Thomas Whitmore spun his web of lies from the witness stand. She was clearly not in her right mind, Thomas was saying, his voice pitched to carry sympathy. After the tragic loss of her illegitimate child, Miss Watson, the defendant, wandered the territory in a state of moral and mental collapse. When I tried to offer Christian charity and bring her back to civilization, she attacked me with a knife. The prosecutor, a thin man with ambitious eyes, nodded gravely. And you believe the Apache influenced her in this violent behavior? Undoubtedly. Everyone knows how those savages treat their women. He's clearly holding her against her will, forcing her into unspeakable acts. Objection! The young lawyer Sarah had hired, one of the few in Santa Fe willing to take their case, shot to his feet. Speculation and racial prejudice have no place in this courtroom. Sustained, the judge said wearily. He was an older man who seemed deeply uncomfortable with the whole proceeding. Stick to the facts, Mr. Whitmore. But the damage was being done, word by word. Thomas painted a picture of Sarah as a fallen woman, too damaged to make rational choices, lured by a dangerous Apache who'd taken advantage of her compromised state. The fact that they'd legally married was twisted into evidence of Taza's manipulation. When Sarah's turn came to testify, she rose carefully. The baby had been active all morning, as if sensing her distress. She made her way to the witness stand, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. State your name for the record, the bailiff instructed. Sarah Grace Crow, formerly Watson. Mrs. Crow. Her lawyer began gently. Can you tell the court about your first encounter with Deputy Whitmore? Sarah met Thomas's eyes across the courtroom. He smirked, confident in his power, his badge, his father's influence. But she was no longer the terrified girl he'd attacked behind the church. It was 2 years ago, in Cedar Springs, Texas. I was the minister's daughter, collecting hymn books from the church after evening service. Mr. Whitmore followed me outside. He had been drinking. He forced himself on me against my will. A murmur ran through the crowd. Thomas's smirk faltered. That's a lie, he burst out. Your Honor, she's always claimed this, but there was never any proof. You'll have your chance to respond, the judge warned. Continue, Mrs. Crow. Sarah told it all. The attack, her father's rejection, the baby lost to neglect and poverty, her months of wandering, trying to find work, dignity, survival, and then her voice warming. She told of finding Taza's cabin in a blizzard, of kindness where she'd expected cruelty, of love growing where the world said only shame should exist. My husband never held me against my will, she finished. He saved my life, respected my choices, and offered me what Thomas Whitmore stole, the right to say yes or no. We married freely, legally. This child I carry was conceived in love, not violence. If that threatens Mr. Whitmore somehow, perhaps he should examine why. Her lawyer presented evidence, their marriage certificate, testimony from the Santa Fe priest who'd married them, even a letter from the doctor who'd examined Sarah and confirmed her pregnancy was progressing normally. But she could see skepticism in too many faces. An Apache and a ruined white woman, their union challenged too many assumptions. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly Apache woman rose from the back of the courtroom. Sarah recognized her. Maria, from the camp Taza had visited, his mother's cousin. I wish to speak, Maria announced in clear English. The judge frowned, This is highly irregular. I have traveled 2 days to be here. Maria continued. I will be heard. Perhaps it was her dignity, or the steel in her voice. But the judge nodded. Approach. Maria walked to the front, her traditional dress a splash of color in the drab courtroom. She looked at Sarah, then at Taza, before addressing the judge. I did not approve when Taza took a white wife, she said bluntly. Our people have suffered too much from yours. But I have watched. I have seen how they are together. She tends him with respect. He protects her with honor. Their child will be of both worlds. This is not easy, but it is not wrong. She turned to face the courtroom. This man, she pointed at Thomas, speaks of savages and Christian charity. But who is savage? The one who builds a home and tends his land in peace, or the one who attacks women and uses law like a weapon? She spat on the floor in Thomas's direction. Among our people, rapists are not given badges. They are given justice. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the room. When order was finally restored, more people began to stand. A merchant from Millbrook testified that Sarah had traded with him fairly, seeming of sound mind. The priest who'd married them spoke of their obvious affection and commitment. Even a white rancher from near their property admitted that Taza had always been a good neighbor, keeping to himself and causing no trouble until certain folks decided to make trouble for him. As the testimony continued, the tide began to turn. The careful narrative Thomas had constructed of a dangerous savage corrupting a helpless woman crumbled against the reality of two people who had simply chosen each other despite the odds. When the judge finally ruled, his voice was tired but firm. While this court cannot condone all the choices made by the parties involved, there is no evidence of kidnapping or coercion. The marriage between Mr. and Mrs. Crow appears legal and consensual. Deputy Whitmore's charges are dismissed. He fixed Thomas with a stern look. Furthermore, given the conflicting testimony about past events in Cedar Springs, I recommend the authorities there reopen their investigation. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell like thunder. Sarah sagged against Taza, relief making her weak. They had won. Not everything, not a complete vindication, but enough. Enough to go home. Enough to raise their child without the immediate threat of legal separation. As they made their way through the crowd, Thomas blocked their path one last time. His face was mottled with rage, his carefully constructed world of privilege and impunity cracking. This isn't over, he hissed. Taza stepped forward, shielding Sarah. Yes, it is. You've lost your power over her. Accept it and move on, or continue down this path and lose more than just a court case. For a moment, violence hung in the air. Then Thomas's father, the former mayor, come to support his son, placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. Enough, the old man said quietly. We're done here. They left, and Sarah knew with bone-deep certainty that they truly were done. Thomas might rage and plot, but his ability to hurt them through the law was broken, and without his badge to hide behind, he was just another coward who preyed on the vulnerable. Outside the courthouse, in the clear Santa Fe sunshine, Sarah breathed deeply for what felt like the first time in months. It's over, she whispered. This part is, Taza agreed. Now we go home and live. The journey back to their ranch was slow, with Sarah needing frequent stops as the baby pressed heavily. But there was no urgency now, no fear snapping at their heels. They were free as an Apache man and a fallen woman could be in a world that preferred its boundaries clear and its people sorted into acceptable categories. As their cabin came into view, Sarah felt tears slide down her cheeks. Home, their home, fought for and won through courage, love, and the support of unexpected allies. The place where their child would be born into a complex heritage, but also into fierce, protective love. That night, as they lay in their bed with Taza's hand gentle on her belly, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought them here. From that frozen night when she'd knocked on his door, more dead than alive, to this moment of quiet triumph. They had both been broken by the world in different ways. But together, they'd found a way to heal, to fight, to build something worth defending. The baby kicked, strong and insistent, and Sarah laughed softly. I think someone approves of today's victory. A fighter, like both parents. Taza murmured against her hair. May they inherit our strengths and learn from our struggles. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the valley, their songs wild and free. The sound no longer frightened Sarah. She was part of this landscape now, part of its harsh beauty and stubborn survival. She had earned her place here through pain and persistence, through love that refused to apologize for existing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would always be those who saw their family as an affront to the natural order. But tonight, in the safety of their hard-won home, Sarah Grace Crow allowed herself to feel something she'd thought lost forever. Hope for the future. Bright and solid, as the child growing within her. They had faced the worst the world could throw at them, and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken, and in the high country of New Mexico, where Apache spirits and settlers' dreams tangled like sweetgrass in the wind. That was its own kind of victory. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human prejudice and pain. But beneath them, two people held each other and dared to believe that love could conquer law, that courage could outlast cruelty, and that somewhere between two worlds, they could build one of their own. Thank you all for listening to this tale from the American frontier. I'd love to know where in the world you're enjoying these Wild West stories. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more authentic tales of love, loss, and redemption in the Old West. And let me know what you thought of Sarah and Taza's journey. Your thoughts and experiences make our campfire circle complete.